Brian, we're headed to the Motor City for this one. The Detroit Lions, a very, very good team in 2024. I think they'll be a good team again in 2025, but talk to me about the season that they had last year.
Yeah, so they went 15-2. They were a really good team. I think they still are a pretty decent team. However, I do believe they slide a little bit this year. I don't think they're as dominated dominating as they were last year, but you know, it remains to be seen. They could. They absolutely could. I'm not saying they couldn't. But, it is the Motor City. It is, you know, home of Kid Rock and Eminem, and where could you go wrong with that combination?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, they were the second ranked offense just behind the Ravens in yards per game, 20th ranked defense. Obviously, we know a lot of that had to do with the Aiden Hutchinson injury. We think getting him back healthy this year is going to do wonders for their defense. But they've also lost a lot. So I guess we'll get into that and kind of the things that have shaped their offseason. So aside from losing both their offensive and defensive coordinators, they've had some player departures. Offensive line, they lost their center, Frank Ragnow. He retired from the NFL. They also lost a guard in Kevin Zeitler to the Titans. But then they lost four corners. Carlton Davis is now a New England Patriot. Efeatu Melifonwu is now a Miami Dolphin. You've got Kendall Vildor, a favorite player of mine, purely because he went to Georgia Southern. So obviously I got to pull for my Eagles in the NFL. Unfortunately, he is now a Tampa Bay Buccaneer, so it's going to be a little bit harder to pull for him than when he was a Chicago Bear. And then Emmanuel Mosley is also no longer a Chicago Bear. He remains unsigned as of this recording. But just before we get into who they've signed, just departures alone, looking at the offensive line and the secondary, I mean, that kind of hurts to lose multiple players from the same position group like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've all heard defense wins championships, and to lose four is that's a lot. That's basically changing up your whole uh, CB room. But and then to lose the coaches on top of that, the big one being big Ben Johnson that we talked about going over to Chicago. You know that I think it's going to be a little bit of a struggle. Um, you know, I think they do have some good additions, and we're going to talk about the additions and the draft. But that's tough. Like I said, it's going to be fun to see how they gel, if they gel, and do they remain in the double digit win column for this year?
Yeah, I mean, you're thinking about the division that they play in. You've got Matthew Golden as a new first round receiver that's going to the Packers. Justin Jefferson, a top two wide receiver in the entire league, is in this division. We talked about with the Chicago Bears that three-headed monster that's formed now with DJ Moore, Roma Dunze, who we both agree are going to have just take a huge leap forward this year, and then second round pick Luther Burden. You've got to have a good secondary because there are elite receiving options in this division. There's very good quarterbacks in this division. If you don't have a good secondary, you're going to get eaten alive. But I've got some good news for not only you, but also Detroit Lions fans, because yes, they did lose four corners into free agency, but they also brought in four corners. So yes, they are reshaping that room. Rock Yassin, DJ Reed, Avonte Maddox, and Khalil Dorsey all signed with the Detroit Lions. They have restocked that room. We're going to see who fits in where, how that depth chart shakes out. Yes, you've got a new defensive coordinator that's going to be in. He's going to pick what works for his scheme, who he likes playing. I think it'll be interesting to watch through training camp. I don't know that this is one of those things where you can look at a depth chart in the middle of July and say, this is who's going to be starting, guaranteed. This is what the snap share is going to look like. I think a lot of this is going to get worked out over the course of the coming weeks as training camp and preseason works itself out. They also brought in a defensive tackle, Roy Lopez, former Arizona Cardinal. I think that was a good, inexpensive signing. I think he can get a lot of snaps in. And then Grant Stewart from Indianapolis, I think, is a linebacker that they needed to bring in, somebody that can provide depth, put a lot of snaps in place, not only on the defensive side of the ball, but also on special teams. So I like what they did there. But they also brought back some of their own players. Kirby Joseph, safety, 4 years, $86 million, the highest paid safety in NFL history. Talk about all the changing of the guard at cornerback position to have a safety of his caliber get re-signed, a lucrative deal that was much earned, have that familiar face in the secondary from that safety spot. I think was just a very good move. It was a mandatory one that they had to lock him up and bring him back as that anchor point of the back half of that defense. They bring back linebacker Derek Barnes. He gets 3 years, $25.5 million. And then Marcus Davenport, that defensive end, kind of a running mate of Aiden Hutchinson, to bring him back and make sure that pass rush stays as dangerous as what we know it to be. Just as far as what they brought in and brought back, what do you think they did as far as setting themselves up for the draft and plugging the holes that they had?
Yeah, I think they did a good job. Again, I think it all goes back to how quickly they all gel together, how lo- how quickly they all learn the new defensive scheme with the new defensive coordinator coming in. There's a lot of that that's going to play into effect, but that's why you have preseason games. That's why you have training camps and the summer, the off season where we're at right now, to get all that worked out and to start meshing together and become that unit of one. That $86 million. Wow. My bank account don't look like that, and I'm sure yours doesn't either. Not many people's do. You know,
I don't play safety like Kirby Joseph does, so I'm not expecting that money to hit my account.
Very, very true, very true. So hopefully he's worth every penny of it. And we've talked about this NFC North and it being such a tough division. I think defense is going to be key because you do have much better offenses across the board in this division. So, it's hopefully he's worth that $86 million and he can kind of offset some of the moves that Chicago's made, that Green Bay's made, that the Vikings have made. We'll see. We'll see how 2025 shapes up.
Yeah, so heading into the draft, especially looking at these first 2 round picks, you've got a new offensive coordinator, you've got a new defensive coordinator, but the head coach remains the same. And he is somebody that is very big on culture, that lunch pail workman type mentality. It's what he is known for. He is very much a hard nosed guy. He's going to outwork everybody. He wants his people that are going to share that. And looking at those top 2 picks, it really shines through that he had his thumb on this draft. So first round pick, falling to the end of the first round, Tyleik Williams, defensive tackle, Ohio State. Maybe some people thought that was a little bit of a reach, but we've talked about this in other videos with other teams. When you're picking at the end of the round, you don't necessarily get your pick of the litter. I'm sure he would have loved to have had a top 10 talent fall into his lap, but it's get your guy season. If you believe that somebody can help make your team better, and it does take 2 to tango, it's very easy for fans to say, oh, he could have been available 15 spots later. Why don't you trade back 10 or 12 spots and get some added draft capital and then make sure you still get your guy? It doesn't always work out that way. And we've seen times where people say, oh, well, this guy was mocked in the second round. You shouldn't have taken him this early. And then another team 2 picks later said, hey, if they didn't take him at 16, we were taking him at 18. So what you saw on your internet mock draft doesn't mean anything because it was written by somebody who doesn't know anything. It only takes one team falling in love with a player to make it worth that pick, especially if they pan out from a talent-wise, a scheme fit, production, all of that stuff. So I don't want to hear anything as far as Tyleik Williams not being worthy of a first-round pick. He is a little inconsistent, but all the physical tools are there to come in and be able to learn from an Aiden Hutchinson. Obviously, a different position, but to play beside him, the mentality, how to win at this level, I think he's going to be a good fit. I don't know that he is even asked to be a day one starter. I think they've got a couple of guys ahead from him that's going to allow him to be part of a rotation and earn his snaps, earn his possibility to produce and earn a bigger role as the course of the season goes on. So I like what they did there. And I think your favorite pick is going to be their second rounder, Tate Ratledge, an offensive guard from Georgia. When you talk about Jared Goff and how good he's been, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jamison Williams, Jahmyr Gibbs, David Montgomery, Sam Laporta, they've got a lot of offensive pieces, but you can't just have hood ornaments without an engine to make that show go. And Tate Ratledge is going to be a part of that engine. He is going to make that offensive line. You look at Penei Sewell and some of the other pieces they've had. I talked about Kevin Zeitler now being a Tennessee Titan. This is somebody that's going to step into one of those guard spots from day one, have that road grading mentality, open up those run lanes for Jahmyr Gibbs, and keep that offensive moving, keep Jared Goff off his back, hopefully, that sort of thing. And so I really like what they did there. And then probably their most interesting pick came in the third round. I think they traded 3 picks to get up to number 70 to take Isaac Tesla, wide receiver out of Arkansas. This is somebody that not have a very big, very productive college career, but has a lot of measurables that people like. And obviously, Detroit saw something that they liked to make him a third round pick first and foremost, but also to invest so much capital. So I think he's somebody that you have to watch for, especially if Jameson Williams doesn't take another step forward. Are you looking at his eventual replacement when he starts looking for a new contract? Maybe Detroit doesn't want to pay him that money, and they think Tesla is that guy that can come across from Amon-Ra St. Brown and fill those shoes. But what do you think about what they did in the draft, specifically through day 1 and 2?
Yeah, I think they did a good job. You talked about the number one pick and trading down for him, and maybe picking up. It takes two to tango. They may have tried that and they didn't have a partner. If you don't have a dance partner, you're not going to go out on the dance floor. So, and they said, hey, let's go ahead and pick this kid up. We can't fall back to take him. So let's just take him now and it's a done deal. Ratledge, he's played a lot of ball at Georgia. I think he was, one of the COVID guys that, got to play a couple extra years for Kirby Smart and the Bulldogs. So he's played a lot of ball. He's very experienced. I think it's a great pickup for them. He's going to be a good guy in the trenches. He's going to provide that stability as long as he goes injury free. And, hopefully he does. I, you know, I don't know a lot about Isaiah or Isaac, you know, like most people. It was just kind of okay, they come up and picked and why. And maybe you're right, maybe they see some kind of measurable that we don't necessarily see. And he does fill in that role nicely. So I hope they did good on their draft day. It remains to be seen, just like all teams. But in this division, you're gonna have to be competitive because I think it's one of the toughest divisions in the NFL.
Yeah, I know you and I had talked about it in a previous video. Grading a draft is impossible, especially before they ever take a snap on an NFL Sunday. And so, whereas we can say Tesla was a reach, we can say Tyleik Williams was a reach. These guys could have been 15 and 20 on their boards, and they're sitting there scratching their heads like, man, how do they fall this far in the draft? And they're thinking they got to steal because we have access to 1% of the information that these NFL teams do. They might be the best interviewed players. They might be the most knowledgeable, the best, scheme fit, culture fit, all these things that we don't know, that we don't have information to. We can look at a McShay or, Kuiper draft, mock draft or draft board or rankings before and think that we know where these players are going to go. We don't have a clue.
Mm-mm.
These teams have so much more invested into these drafts than what we could even possibly imagine. It's truly their jobs on the line, so they have to make what they think are the best picks. And so if they think Tyleik Williams is the first round pick, if they think that Tesla is worth 3 picks to come up and make sure they got it, they have my attention. I'm willing to see what these players turn into, how much they contribute for a team that last year was 15-2. That being said, I don't think either one of us see them getting 15 wins again this year. So,
Mm-mm.
what kind of win total are you expecting for Detroit in 2025?
Again, it's so hard to tell. I think all four of these teams are going to be really good. I do think Chicago steals a couple of wins from Detroit. I do think Chicago steals a couple of wins from the Vikings. You know, it's very hard to say. I still think they remain in the double digits. I think they stay in that 11 game win area. I wouldn't be surprised if they drop all the way to 9 wins. I would not be surprised if they came only dropped a couple and picked up 13. So I'm gonna have them in that 11 and 6 area.
Yeah, I've got them at 10-7, tied for the second best record in the division. I think kind of like what we talked about all week. This is going to be a very closely contested division. I think we've said that multiple times across
Yep.
these videos, and it's going to stand true in this one as well. You look at how good Chicago has improved. You look at the Vikings were right behind them last year, and obviously the Packers are very good at addressing their needs and doing things that they didn't even do when Aaron Rodgers was there, adding a first round wide receiver, making sure that Jordan Love has an abundance of weapons. This is going to be a very interesting division. And I would say maybe even the best division in football, just because you can look at a team that's 10-7 or 11-6 and think, oh, well, this team is 13-4. They're better. No, they're not. They just probably play in a weaker division overall. They got some easier wins. There's not going to be easy wins in this division, I don't think,
Mm-mm.
barring some sort of catastrophic injury happening to a quarterback in the division or something along those lines. That being said,
Well, hang on,
you
hang
know,
on. I want to switch it up just a little bit because, we always move into the team strengths. I really want to get into their concerns. What are you worried about with the Lions this year? We gave our
well,
predictions and we got them a lot lower. So obviously there's concerns. What are those concerns?
Well, even before I got into that, I had another note on their schedule. So when
Oh
I
yeah.
say that they're going to lose five more games this year than they did last year, that's not necessarily me being low on the Lions to say, oh, they only lost two games last year. Why do I think they're going to lose seven? If you look at their schedule this year, it's not easy. Not only do they have obviously their conference opponents they've got to play twice, or I'm sorry, their division opponents they have to play twice. And we talked about how good those teams are going to be. But if you look at their away schedule, obviously they play the Bears and the Packers and the Vikings, but then they also have to play the Commanders. They have to play the Ravens, the Eagles, the Rams, and the Chiefs, all on the away side of their schedule. That is absolutely brutal for any team. I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're the best team in the NFL. And I'm not willing to say that the Lions are or aren't at this point, but that is just a murder's row of teams to play, and you don't even get the benefit of playing them at your home stadium. That is just, it's reason enough for me to say they're going to lose a few more games than what they did last year. Doesn't mean that they're going to regress as a team, does not mean that they're going to be a basement level team or anything like that. It just means that they're going to have a lot harder sledding this year than they did last year. So my big concern for them is the loss of Ben Johnson, an offensive coordinator, now being the Chicago Bears head coach, staying in the division but taking over that offense. He's going to know your team's strengths and weakness. He's going to be able to game plan against you effectively. And then obviously they lost Aaron Glenn, their defensive coordinator, now the head coach of the New York Jets. If the guys that were replacing them were as good or better, they would already be in those positions. So I expect them to have a little bit of a step up into the learning curve, maybe a little bit of a struggle to learn those roles. They probably haven't been play callers on Sundays before, now having to go from being what's usually a position coach where you're saying, oh, I was the linebackers coach. Now I'm the defensive coordinator. Now you're not focusing on one position group. Now you're focusing on the entire defense, the play calling, game plans, all of those things. It is just going to be something that some people pick it up right away, and maybe they do, and we sound foolish as a result. But I think it would be a little bit too optimistic to say that they're going to be just as good as the guys that they are replacing, who obviously were very good and excelled in their positions, and they got rewarded for that with head coaching positions this offseason.
And that's why I wanted to move into the concerns because, yeah, you're correct. Losing your OC and DC, that is tough for any team. But then you throw in that schedule, and that is just brutal. We're already saying they're gonna potentially drop, one or maybe both to Chicago. They're maybe drop one to uh the Vikings or both to the Vikings, and then you throw on that brutal away schedule on top of that. That's a huge concern, and for this whole team. Now, do they have some really good players? Yes, they do. We're gonna mention that in their strengths, and then moving on into fantasy football, there are still players I want, but I just this is going to be a tough year for the Lions, and I hope they're up for the challenge. And being from the Motor City, Motown, I think they are.
Yeah, I think obviously I'm going to not earn any fans with this one, maybe some Lions fans, but I'm going to throw a couple of shots, and a couple other teams in the NFL are going to catch some strays with this comment. Teams aren't lining up to take the offensive and defensive coordinators away from Cleveland every year. When we talked about Seattle Seahawks and why we were so surprised by the almost blind optimism around their team, one of the things that you and I talked about off camera was that Seattle doesn't have the best of any one position. They don't have the best quarterback. They've got good running backs, but they don't have a Bijan or a Gibbs or a Saquon. I think Kenneth Walker is good, but I don't think he is that top upper echelon of players. JSN, we like. Cooper Kupp was great at one point in time in his career. I'm not sure how good he's going to be this year. But when you look at the Detroit Lions, they were 15-2 last year because their defense was great, because their offense was great. They overcame the adversity of losing Aiden Hutchinson. They have cornerstone talent. Jared Goff is a Super Bowl level quarterback. He's been there. Amon-Ra St. Brown, top 5 receiver in the game, if you ask me. Jahmyr Gibbs, a top 2, top 3 running back in this league. You cannot argue with what he's done. And then a guy like Aiden Hutchinson. What a blow it was to their defense when he got hurt last year. It was something that they never really recovered from. You could not replace what he was for that defense. So they have cornerstones at different positions throughout the offense and defensive side of the ball. We talk about Kirby Joseph, obviously, as another one. So that is their biggest strength. They have top shelf talent on both sides of the ball. So can that help offset the concerns that we have with losing their coordinators? Yes, that's why we're saying they lose both of those, and that's why we're not saying they went from being 15-2 to being 2-15. I still peg them to be a 10 or 11 win team this year. It is a testament to the talent, the ability to coach up players and put them in positions to succeed. No, I'm not hitting the panic alarm on the Detroit Lions. I do not think that they are a bad team. I think they are a good team, maybe not as good as what they were last year, who the schedule makers did not do any favors for. So I don't want anybody to think that we're just completely down and out on the Detroit Lions. I still think they are a very good team. I just think that they are going to have to overcome a lot this year to get back to what they were last year. They are not going to have a stroll into the number 1 seed at the playoffs like they did last year. I don't think they are a first round bye team purely because I think there are some other teams that are set up to win more games this year than what they are. But that being said, all you have to do is get into the playoffs, and you've got just as good a shot as anybody else. Look at what the Commanders did last year, making it all the way to the NFC Championship game with a rookie quarterback. I think that the Detroit Lions are still a playoff caliber team, and it wouldn't surprise me if they still won this division.
Yep, 100%. And, real quick, we've gone through a lot of their great players. And so we'll keep the fantasy football portion a little bit shorter because you know who we're going to take. You know, give me St. Brown first round. I'm happy all day long. Even, and heaven forbid I pick him up in the second round. You know, and if I don't get Brock Bowers in the second or third round, I'm just as happy, or well, not just as happy, but I'm kind of happy that I'm picking up Laporta, in the fourth or fifth round. So that's a couple of guys. Their defense, they do have some big name talent. There's a reason why they signed that $86 million contract. You know, I'm not angry with their defense. I'm taking it. The only thing that I would worry about as far as taking their defense in a fantasy league is who they're playing against. That's a brutal schedule. So, you know, do I sit them on my bench as a backup defense? Yeah, potentially, but I just think there's a lot better defenses with a lot better schedules that I would likely pick up. Who are you putting on your teams?
Yeah, I think the biggest name that you didn't mention is Jahmyr Gibbs. You talk
Yeah.
about a first round pick, probably a top 5 pick. People are fighting over Jahmyr Gibbs and Bijan Robinson, just like they're fighting over Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson. Jahmyr Gibbs, especially in PPR leagues, where you can really take advantage of his skill set, not only as a runner, but as a receiver. It's almost unmatched in the league how good he is, the utilization. It's very Alvin Kamara-esque, where when Alvin Kamara had first come into the league, everybody's like, oh, that's Mark Ingram's backup. And then even as Mark Ingram's backup, he was like the number 2 running back in fantasy because he caught so many passes. He scored a bunch of touchdowns. His utilization meant more than what his actual workload entailed because he didn't have to have 25 touches a game to be great. He might only have 15, and he was doing more on a per touch basis. That's Jahmyr Gibbs. He is easily a top 2, top 3 back in this league, and he is absolutely great for fantasy. And if you let another David Montgomery injury happen, like what happened last year, oh my God, Jahmyr Gibbs to the moon because he gets all the work. There's nobody else that's taking anything away from him. He's out there just about every single snap and doing great things with every opportunity he gets to possess the ball. He's somebody that you have to scheme for and scheme against every single down. You have to know where he is because if the ball's in his hands, something good is happening more often than not. And then the other intriguing name that we haven't mentioned so far is Jameson Williams. He's somebody that had a really good year last year. Somebody could say that was his breakout year, but there are a lot of very knowledgeable people in the fantasy football space that I follow and that I interact with that say Jameson Williams hasn't had his true breakout yet. It's happening this year. So if you look at what he did last year and think that he's going to expand upon that and get an even larger target share of this offense, watch out, because that's somebody that you're not having to use a particularly early round pick on, but add him in and you put him in your wide receiver 3 spot, put him in your flex spot, and then just watch those explosions happen. Because yeah, you might get a game where he only has 3 points. He might only have 1 catch for 21 yards, and you're like, man, that sucks. But you might also have the game where he catches 3 passes for 150 yards and 2 touchdowns because all of them were just huge gains. I mean, he is that type of explosive receiver, and it's somebody that you have to take the bad along with the good, but the good can be great. And if he gets more consistent, gets more targets, more looks every single week, it's going to be really impressive what he can do with it as a part of this offense. So new play caller might come in and say, hey, we want to feature Jameson Williams over Amon-Ra St. Brown. I'd be very surprised by that. I'm super high on Amon-Ra St. Brown. I even made a trade for him in one of my dynasty leagues this offseason to add him to my roster, and I don't regret that. But Jameson Williams is an intriguing name for fantasy football as well.
Yep. All right, guys. Well, that's going to bring us to the end of this video and the NFC North. We will see you next week when we're back in the AFC. We appreciate it. And if you are enjoying this series, you'll always give us a like, a comment, and by all means, hit that subscribe button.